I mean, Louise McWhirter's book, which is openly available for anyone to download from the internet and to look into that, and it goes into great detail about forecasting. And I think it's an absolutely excellent book to give anyone who's got the time to do the research an ability to do some basic forecasting, because it is so brilliant the way that she lays it out. And of course, it's the astrology in that which is your key for unlocking the Gann financial timetable, which, as I mentioned to you, I think he copied from an earlier version that was put together by Lowry Research. And all of this, again, I will link to it in the report that I send out with this, because I have written in detail on that cycle, because of course it resonates with the land cycle, which is why. And then of course, when you go back even further, you've got the stone circles and Stonehenge, of course, which were aligned to the nodal cycle, so therefore aligned to an 18-year cycle. And it's probably why Dewey wrote in his book that he co-authored with Dakin, that the 18-year cycle was probably the most important economic indicator that we have, because as I said, so many of the cycles that you forecast on show those resonances. So if we can find, it really is as easy as that, as to doing these counts and finding where those points are, and then looking back and studying history, which is vital to the research, and noticing the parallels that give you that. I am
Sorry,
yeah,
let me just come in on that.
yeah.
A couple of things. First of all, Gann very clearly said you can do things using planetary work, but you can also do them mathematically. So that raises the question of which is the higher order. And I think mathematical cycles are of a higher order. But also, just what you've mentioned now about Stonehenge, Avebury, all these circles that we have here in Britain, they are eclipse calculators. Okay. And the eclipse cycle is the Saros cycle. And it's the Saros cycles that, if you look at, will repeat mathematically, and will also see repetitions of history there. So that's exactly it. Yeah.
Yes, and the Saros cycle, and again, I'll link to this in the report. Benner relied on that. He talked about that in his book, and he's, I think this is, whenever I do a lecture on this. I did a lecture for an accountants organisation in Australia, and they gave me the platform for 45 minutes. And I thought, oh, this is a great time to say to all of these accountants, if you want to protect your clients, I can tell you when things are going to happen. And this is how we do it. And, to me, it's mind-blowing that we've got these financial calculators that were written sort of 150 years ago that forecast the 2008 financial crisis, which is the one closest in memory for these accountants to relate to prove how easy it is to forecast economic downturns. And I remember there's just this deadpan look as I was giving this lecture, and I was thinking, why aren't you excited about this? This is just so mind-blowingly simple and phenomenal. And yet we have central banks and politicians, and as you mentioned, which again I thought was so interesting, about Trump's last term. Of course, he presided over the COVID panic, which was a significant crisis, because if we think about the stock market chart as really just being a barometer of people's emotions, but also the fact that, and I think this is what the ancients were looking at when they were looking at, times of good and times of bad, is that they're just generally times of which your health might be impacted, which could have to do with the sunspot cycle, but where your health might be impacted, where you might feel down, just as we do in winter, where, you might have a bit of a financial dilemma, when you might have a bit of a family dilemma. So probably you can find cycles in many things, outside of, sort of what's happening on the stock market. And the pandemic, I think, was a classic example of that occurring, locking everybody down and giving everybody a very miserable time through that period. So even if you were saved financially, you weren't going to get away without having a bit of a miserable time. But of course, it's interesting that Trump, being in his presidency now, is likely to be presiding over another financial downturn, assuming that he survives his term. And so even though he's come in with more of an idea about what he wants to do, and he's certainly wiser and more calculated in the policies that he's putting forward, it is interesting to see that resonance. He's a very interesting character, isn't he?
Well, what I would say here is that, look, he's a very polarizing character. People love him, people hate him. He has arrived at the point in time where the cycles aren't particularly in his favor with regard to the business side. In his last term, he would say, well, just look at the stock market to judge how well we've been. Well, how well the administration has performed. Of course, right now, that isn't the right thing to say, although the last 2 days have been quite important. And I'm just going to jump back to something that you mentioned in that last piece there. If you talked about health and illness and so on and so on. If you take a 10-year timeline of your own life and mark down where you've had, say, a bad flu, or you've had a new relationship, or changed your job and all the rest of it, and you will see how they align, and they align differently. And you can spin that out. If you're a bit older, you can put it into a 20-year cycle as well, and the 20-year cycle being the more important, the decennial cycle being half of that. So Gann makes that very clear. And again, there are you can look at it in pure numbers as 10, 20-year cycles. You can also ascribe it to planetary synodic cycles of Jupiter and Saturn. But have a look at those, and that's where the commodity markets also, if you really look into Gann stuff, he had 20-year week charts and so on. And so this is really important. And if we take this idea of your own personal life as well, the reason markets are so useful for research, because if I said to you, Catherine, what happened to you on, say, the 5th of May 2013, unless something really big did happen, there was a major event, you got married, or somebody passed away, or child was born, or something like that, you probably don't remember. And the point is that, did you wake up that day thinking it's going to be a great day, and the day got better, and then you closed on a real high, in which case you're a stock market up bar for the day? But did you wake up and think, bad morning, afternoon got better, feeling about where I'm the same? So, and this is what price does. A price chart, a candlestick, Japanese candlestick, or a price open, high, low, close bar is just an illustration of the sentiment. And of course, this is sort of this is the stuff I'm really fascinated by now. The idea is that if you look at these price bars in a bull market, that bull market might run, well, in this case, 15 years, right? It might run a few weeks, months. But, did you just have 3 or 4 great weeks in your own life where, something exciting was happening? You started a new business, it was going very well. You have a new relationship and that's going well. Or then did you get to a top and something wasn't quite working out and things don't, and you have a little bit of a bear market. And it might be a bear market it might be a health bear market. Got a little bit of a problem, you need to get it sorted out, go and see people, surgeons or whatever. Or it might be this relationship ain't working, and then you carry on up again, and so on. So these waves of sentiment occur with us individually, as well. And that's the real fascination. But it's only when you look at a market chart that's you can quantify and measure these things, and you can see how patterns, how we know certain markets have lasted exactly the same. The bull market in wheat from 2020 up to the high was exactly the same number of days as a previous bull market. And when you know these things, you can know where to look. So there's a few more clues about how we do some stuff there as well.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that, because I think that was the 50-year cycle, wasn't it? In that you were looking at with the 2020, you were talking about wheat, were you?
Oh, yeah. Yes, that's absolutely right. Yes, that was, yes. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, we can come back to that. Sorry, I kind of derailed you a bit. I just wanted to bring this point about human
Yes.
sentiment, and
Yeah,
so on.
yeah.
But yeah, Trump. Yeah, we can come back to that 50-year cycle as well. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
so
But
because what I wanted to talk about, just going off from that, because I mean, I mentioned to you, we had a quick conversation on the phone last night, and we were talking about how this is such a passion once you get into cycles. And I think that it is because people recognize that there's a foundational truth in this that they resonate with on a personal basis, because we live with cycles around us in nature that we can see, and we can chart from year to year with the seasons, and maybe with a menstrual cycle, and maybe with the other cycles we have with bringing up children, and we can notice things that happen from years to year. We mark dates naturally as part of our human evolution. In religions, there is a cycle in religion. There certainly is in Judaism. And so, and then of course, everybody has their own individual calendars, and the calendars are aligned with the planets. And so all of these things kind of resonate. What I was interested when you said, we don't go into detail about how we put together our forecasting for the small movements more so
Yeah.
than the big movements. I am interested to know whether it has some relativity to those bigger cycles, because you mentioned the quote from Ecclesiastes earlier, which is that everything repeats. There's nothing new under the sun. And it's a brilliant book. If anyone has never read that book in the Bible, it's well worth going to read. It's a very readable book, and it's one of those ones, it can really depress you actually reading it. But it is one of those ones that when you read it, you sort of think, oh gosh, this is so interesting if you are into cycles, reading this prose on it. But because the other thing is in biblical prophecy, which I think Gann quoted as well, was this idea of wheels within wheels. It's this idea that the smaller harmonics of cycles, often the bigger cycles that you notice, they just break down and break down and break down. And so I was curious to know whether that formed the basis of the research you do for the movements in the markets.
So yeah, definitely. So we're talking about wheels within wheels. We're referencing the Bible. We're talking about Ezekiel. We're talking about Daniel, and of course Ecclesiastes. Not to mention the most discussed and least understood book of Revelations. So, but yes, yeah. I mean, the 100-year patterns are basically a fractal of the 1,000-year patterns. The 50-year is a breakdown of that, and the decennial cycle is a hundredth of the 1,000-year pattern, and so on. So there's no doubt about that. The only problem is we really only have 2,000 years of history that we can use economically. Yes, we can identify other events, but there's not enough of them. So there is the reason we put it all into histograms is there are so many different things in there, and basically it got to the point where very early on we would talk about some of the stuff in there, but that's only 10% of what's in there as we find other things. And there are other things that occur, which I write in the report. For people who are new to the report, is this idea that there are certain cycles. They only have to appear once. That's it, and they themselves will create an event by themselves. That's it. But other times, if we're going back to that cafe, if there's 20 of us in there, we might get a big party suddenly coming in, and that's a lot of smaller cycles coming together, but happening to fall within the same time window. So what really I'm saying is that there is no my 30 years plus research shows that there is no one thing, well, apart from that one, the occasional thing that's a one-off will create a change in trend. But there are changes in trend that occur when that's not present as well. So there is no one thing. And this whole idea of incremental gains, there's little bits and pieces that we put together. And when you get a stacking of them, a strong histogram peak, then we are going to see a trend change. Equally, if we get that one event, which happens very rarely, it did actually happen in February 2020. That was the one there that highlighted that particular top. Then yes, that's so. I don't mean to sound too cryptic, but there is so much to put together. There is no one particular thing that works, or if there is, I haven't found it. And but what I have seen is that if you go back and say, well, why didn't we find that one, or why didn't we, where did that come from? There'll be something there that we haven't found. So I always maintain. I've always wanted to meet Nassim Taleb and discuss the Black Swan with him. But never managed that yet. But this idea that actually that was a potential black swan to us, but there's no such thing as a black swan because it's just a cycle that we haven't seen before, we've missed or whatever, and the interesting thing about cycles is human sentiment gets extreme, and the Ukraine thing was an interesting one. People were talking about oil going all the way up to $200-300, within weeks, but we had a major cycle just within 3 weeks of the incursion into Ukraine. And so the same again, with Trump this last December. This is the Trump bump. We're off to the races. Let's all pile in. People are buying everything at the top. Joe Public was buying it. So this is the whole point: is that cycles get veiled as well in sentiment as well. That in itself is an indicator. So this is this whole idea of your individual mood bars, and then there's the mass collective sentiment as well, the herd mentality. So so in answer to your question, and going back to that, there is there is no one thing that really puts it together, but definitely fractal patterns. Yeah, I mean, absolutely, because the 20-year pattern is a fifth of the 100 years and so on. And for me, we talked about the Saros cycles, which are 18.6 years, and the 90-year cycle is 518 year cycles. So people say, oh, what about the 2.5 years now that we're missing, and so on. And there are other ways of fine-tuning that. So it's a broad brush thing, but arguably 20 years as a generation, 18 to 20 years as a generation of people. And so if we work in generational cycles, that seems to deliver answers. Once you get to 3 generational cycles, 60 years, say, events occur. If you take 9/11, September the 11th, 2001, America was attacked on its own soil. When was the previous time? It was 7th of December 1941, 60 years to within one season's accuracy,
Yeah. Yeah,
So
it's remarkable. It's that there's a lot more that I want to ask you because about but before I go on to a tangent, I'm actually interested in. I want to get onto war cycles. I know I need to,
sure.
but before I just before I do that, I am interested because you started at the beginning of this conversation talking about Gann, and it must have been a revelation. There's many people that study Gann, and Gann is one of those people that has an obsessive following of traders that I've spent 50 years studying Gann, and they become so obsessed with him, and almost to the point that they feel like they're Gann reincarnated. And I know a few people that resonate that obsessively about him. There's a lot of controversy surrounding his research. I know that Larry Williams doubted that he was that you could learn a lot from Gann, and he valued other people's work higher. And Larry Williams obviously did his own research on the decade cycle, and would reference you'll make more money by understanding that, and the other researchers that have talked about it than you will with Gann. And of course then I think there was his son that came out and said that he made more money selling his courses than he did trading, and so on and so forth. And then the article that was written in Ticker, what was the name of the magazine?
The Ticker Digest, the 1908 article. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Where they did, they monitored his trades and said, 80% of these trades or whatever, some remarkable thing. And then I think there was claims after that had been, some money had gone under the table as a bribe for that interview, and that's why it came across so well in the magazine. Now, you can't wipe Gann off the table because he was absolutely remarkable. I mean, his writing was remarkable. What the codes that he obviously knew a lot, the codes that he enshrined in the Tunnel Through the Air, his annual forecast, which picked the tops in the market. I am curious, as to what where you kind of rate him in your own. Now you've had years, of studying the markets yourself,
Yeah, sure. I'll be delighted to talk about this. So, obviously, being very close to the family that are custodians of Gann's work, I've been through everything there. Okay, and there is no doubt that Gann was a very wealthy man. There's no doubt about that. Okay, I think earlier on he definitely made money from trading. He owned an aircraft. His pilot was Eleanor Smith, a famous lady aviator. He was involved with Freemasonry, but he was demitted from that. It is undoubted, you can't question the fact he was definitely an astrologer. There's a lot of stuff there that's he's used all that information there. There's not so much evidence of him trading so much in his latter days. There are some things that show that there are better times to trade than others. And I think when he did that exhibition, if it was true, then basically he had picked a time that was very favorable to him. Now, whether he picked that time for self-promotion or whether he genuinely created those trades, we'll never know. We don't know. There are no real trading records there. There are his personal diaries, one of which has been released, is in the public domain. The others aren't. They were missing. That was the one event back in the mid-90s that Nikki Jones sort of effectively earned her trust, and which is why she needed somebody to help out. They were missing. They were in somebody else's collection. I found out where they were, retrieved them, and returned them to America. That's enough said on that. But within those, there was some tremendous information that suggested that he did have something. And um, I think a lot of it was just he was just a very hard worker. So some of the stuff I use and teach in our trading courses doesn't involve Gann because there are things that do work better. I'm going to go back to Larry Williams. I think Larry Williams is an excellent trader. He's a friend of the foundation, and he's an acquaintance of mine, somebody I like very much. I think what Larry does say about cycles and Gann is that, well, we never really knew what Gann was doing. That's a fair comment. Nobody knew what Gann was doing. You know, that's the first thing we all agree. What is Gann? It's a series of about 15 techniques. You can draw angles, you can draw lines, you can draw squares, you can use a square of 9, you can use the circle of 12 or whatever, you know, the 24 and all the rest of it. And some of it works some of the time. None of it works all of the time. And I think Larry was really saying that if you're trading, then you want to have something that has structure. And, you know, Larry, when he talks with the foundation, will say, well, cycles just give you some clues. You know, that's it. You can't trade from a cycle, but you can get an advantage from it. So I think, in fairness to Larry, that's that there. And I think the point is the whole thing's become so mystical. And, you know, I laugh and I see people, you know, people talk about the Gann emblem, you know, and how that was a key. The Gann emblem was created by Nikki and her husband when they went out for a day to a country fair, and they saw it there as an astrological sign. And of course, people are swearing by it, all the Gann experts on the different groups. And it, you know, all I can say is that I feel very humbled and very privileged to have actually seen all the core material. He's got some amazing work on sunspots, and that I think was critical to a lot of his work. And I think sunspot activity, even now, is something I follow. That's actually one of the things we do put into this, and that definitely impacts human sentiment. Definitely, not just that, but individual space weather days where we, you know, when you know, which is now getting a lot more interest because it can damage satellites and communication lines as well. So I'm sorry, I'm jumping around here, but these are things that Gann was definitely looking at. So what I do think is understated is the fact that because Billy Jones and Nicky Jones, you know, bought all this stuff, they bought the entire Gann collection, all the papers for $10,000, which is a lot of money at the time, and they transported it all the way through. If it wasn't for that, all this work would be dissipated. It would have all disappeared. They were able to put how to make profits and commodities back into print, and that's the book that then sort of proliferated all the way. Of course, Gann is huge in Australia. It's a real big fascination, isn't there? But we know he had fancy cars. He definitely had planes. There's some pictures that are not in the public domain that show that. And um, dare I say, he did have 3 wives. He was a workaholic, and my wife actually was gifted some of Blondie Gann's jewelry, so she owned some of Gann's jewelry. So, yeah.
Yeah. Wow, that's quite incredible. Yeah, well, he would have had to have worked hard with 3 wives, I imagine, sort of going through that. He was a hard worker to for that. So yeah, I mean,